Good evening and welcome. Thank you for joining us tonight for part one of an introduction to conservation grazing. Meadows require management if they're not to become scrub, then woodland. The majority of all field scale types of meadows are grazed at critical times of the year. We are delighted to have three speakers share with us tonight the ways that grazing with livestock can support the making of an ecologically rich meadow with more flowers and more wildlife. Tonight's presentations are about an hour in total, followed by a question and answer session. So do put any questions you have as we go along in the chat bar, and then they'll be fed to the speakers at the end of the talks. Before I introduce our first speaker, I'd just like to mention More Meadows for those who have joined the talk from outside our network. So a little bit about that. More Meadows is a community group based on Dartmoor, and we have over 1,000 supporters. It's for people who wish to restore or create meadows on any scale, from a meadow in the garden to field scale species-rich grassland. We have a website, Facebook page, and a forum, a new forum called the Meadow Makers Network. And the forum is the place to connect with others across the county and beyond. There are several local groups forming, including in Cornwall and Somerset. Finally, we have a meadows map, and that's hosted on our website where people can add their meadow. It's a wildlife network, really, building across the county. There's now over 1,500 acres on there, 1,062 mapped on Dartmoor alone, and an additional 471 across the rest of Devon. So you're very welcome to add your meadow too if you haven't already. And the map can be found on our website, moremeadows.org.uk. Now, I'd like to introduce you to our first speaker, Jerry Tallowin. Jerry is a grassland ecologist and emeritus research scientist of Rothamsted Research in Devon. The main themes of his research pre-retirement were grazing ecology and the maintenance and restoration of grassland biodiversity in the UK and Europe. Several agri-environment scheme options designed to maintain high nature value grasslands were underpinned by the results of his research. Jerry has published over 100 scientific papers and reports. He has also produced reviews on productivity and forage value and ecologically sustainable management of semi-natural grasslands. Jerry is chairman of the Ecological Continuity Trust, a unique charity dedicated to preserving the national resource of long-term ecological field experiments across the UK. These experiments provide evidence bases for policy making, sustainable land use and education. Jerry is a keen ornithologist and is a licensed bird ringer, an enthusiastic gardener, cake maker and traveller. Over to you, Jerry. You've many strings to your bow, and I've been very much looking forward to your talk.
Thank you, Donna. Can people put up my slideshow, please? Okay. First glitch of the evening when the slideshow doesn't come up full screen. Can somebody please put it up full screen? Well, first of all, this is a glitch which I wasn't expecting with the not able to put it onto full screen. But anyway, if somebody could just sort that one out. Tracy or whoever, can they put it onto full screen, please? Yeah, it was a good start. Apologies, everybody, that we are having a glitch at the moment with getting this into full screen. Tracy?
I can't do anything from this end, Jerry. You're going to have to, is it not, do you want to take it off again and we'll put it on full screen and then I'll put it on full screen. So if I I'll take it out. And then if you can unshare screen and share screen again, maybe.
I'll stop sharing and then I'll put it on to again. So
yeah,
share screen.
Okay. I've got the screen with us on, so if you can put your PowerPoint onto there, that'll be sorted. That's it. And then can you put it on?
Yep, here we go. Right,
Yay.
sorry about that, everybody. Well, good evening, everybody, and thank you for those kind words of introduction, Donna. First of all, I'd like to just give you what I think is a pretty good definition of what conservation grazing is all about. Livestock grazing that delivers multiple benefits for wildlife and people now and into the future. Now, the aims of conservation grazing is essentially to create structure within grasslands, to create height patchiness, and to also allow wildflowers and what diversity you have in your grassland to flower, to set seed, and to disperse. And those combination of factors will allow a wide diversity of invertebrates to occupy your grasslands. We've already mentioned that one of the other issues about conservation grazing is to control scrub development. But unseen, but equally important, is that conservation grazing should maintain soil structure and soil carbon stores. These semi-natural grasslands are incredibly important for soil carbon storage. And at the same time, conservation grazing should maintain or improve soil biodiversity. Before anybody starts on a conservation grazing project, they should have a grazing plan. And that grazing plan should be based upon the existing habitats that you may or may not have within your site. So first of all, the identification of what you have and what you would like. And often it's a case of where you've got a very species, wildflower poor, I keep on talking about species poor, but a wildflower poor of grassland. It's really quite often a case of creating appropriate new habitats. I put a question mark against restoring lost habitats, because now with climate change as one issue, but also the fact that much of our landscape is devoid of the desirable species we'd like to reintroduce to our grasslands. So it's a case really now of many of us accepting that we're going to, if we haven't got a species-rich grassland, creating a new habitats. The other issue about having a grazing plan is clearly the rather more practical issues, such as fencing. If your site isn't fenced, then fencing can be a considerable expense. And particularly if you're considering using sheep, because breeds such as Welsh Mountain, Scottish Halfbreds and such like are notorious escape artists. So you need to have fencing, and fencing is a considerable cost. But there's now growing interest in invisible fencing, and that's where you're using GPS on animals to basically train them to avoid going into more sensitive habitats. I'm not going to say much more about invisible fencing, which it was invincible, but invisible fencing is in fact something that is, as I say, of growing interest, and perhaps we can leave more discussion to later on in the question time. Livestock availability. Now this really issue, whether you want to own your own livestock or you have a grazier who can give you or lend you livestock. The critical thing about livestock that you don't own is you need to have a grazier who is reliable and also understands what you want to achieve on your site. And if you have your own stock, you have to consider whether you can have a spare paddock, because should you start running out of grass during your grazing period, or it becomes too wet, you need to have somewhere to move animals off before they do damage to your conservation area. I also mentioned adjacent habitats. If you are fortunate in having nearby species-rich habitats that you can have stock that can move from those habitats onto your site, this is incredibly important for potential seed movement and the allowance of seed to get established on your site that otherwise wouldn't be so easy or would be very expensive to sow in. And I mentioned bringing livestock, using livestock to sow seed. We have evidence now that about over 80% of Europe's grassland plant species can pass through the intestine of ruminants and come out at the back end viable and ready to germinate. And also, of course, they are encased in a package of nutrients as well. And this practice of using livestock to disperse flowering plants is well tried within agriculture and used for moving legumes around into pastures which haven't got legumes. And it has been a well tried and very useful approach. One of the constraints I mentioned is if you have a public footpath running through, because dog worrying now is, I think, a growing issue. And if you have got a public footpath and people walking their dogs, I feel that the best advice is to put a pig netting and barbed wire fencing to stop that hazard from occurring. Okay, the factors influencing the structure and biodiversity of grassland habitats is the disturbance type. And I've mentioned cutting here for completeness sake, but I'm not going to say much more about cutting because the scale at which cutting creates structure in your grasslands is at orders of magnitude above that the grazing animal can create disturbance scales. First of all, at the bite scale, animal size, its behaviour and physiology will influence the bite size scale of disturbance or patches within your grassland. The patch scale, of course, depends on grazing intensity and duration. Okay, so we have three herbivore types that we can use. Of course, you've got to take into account whether your grassland site has also wildlife, such as deer, rabbits, that are using it, because they need to be taken into account for the grazing and the patchiness that they can cause as well. But I'm going to focus particularly on the three livestock types which you are probably going to focus on or could focus on. Sheep, first of all, they have a bite size, and the bite size is in fact a measure of the dental arcade, and the bite size is between 4 and 5 centimeters. And I'll go into why they can actually bite very close to the soil surface in a moment with the next slide. But basically, the sheep can graze to within 2 to 3 centimeters of the soil surface. Their ability to select species within the grassland is actually high, largely to do with the fact that they've got a very small mouth size. Cattle, on the other hand, have an average bite size or dental arcade of about 10 centimeters, and the way they graze limits the distance from the ground surface that they can graze to. I'll mention why that is in a second. And their ability to select is also relatively low compared with sheep and to ponies. Ponies have a similar dental arcade and bite size to cattle at around 10 centimeters, and they can bite very close to the ground, in fact, to ground surface level, and their ability to select is also very high. So this slide here can actually illustrates quite well why sheep, they have a prehensile upper lip, a pad on the upper palate, and then forward pointing teeth on the lower palate. So they can get pretty close to the ground. And sheep, as you probably well know, have a bad press generally. George Monbiot called them white woolly maggots on the landscape. But actually, that is probably to do with the way, well, it is totally the way they've been managed. Low stocking rates over extensive areas where the sheep can actually select their preferred forages and ignore the less preferred forages, which in turn will come to dominate the grassland. Cattle here, the pictures here show really well that cattle have a prehensile tongue that wraps around the foliage, and that limits the height of foliage that they can actually get hold of and bite or pull. Ponies, this top slide shows you admirably why ponies and horses can get very close to the ground surface, and they can graze, as I said, close to the ground level or at the ground level and create bare ground. And this, in certain situations, such as heathlands, can be very good for what we call thermophilic species, so ants, grading butterflies, sand lizards, and others, which like warm conditions. So ponies are really good at creating very close crop lawns and patches of bare ground. Okay, now having denigrated sheep managed well can produce a really varied sward, but at low stocking rates, providing you manage and watch the way they're grazing and move them on either in a paddock system or into a spare area if they're overgrazing and creating very close patches and grazing out their desired species, which, if they're left to their own devices, they can actually graze them out. Cattle, they're relatively unselective grazers, as I said, but they're really good for species-rich grassland. They can push through scrub because of their structure and build. They eat taller and coarser vegetation, and they leave tussocky patches, which are really beneficial for invertebrates and small mammals. Cattle avoid eating around their dung pats, particularly freshly dropped dung pats, and that is why you see that patchy mosaic within cattle grazed grasslands. Ponies are generally, they're monogastric. They don't have a rumen like sheep and cattle. With sheep and cattle, they have several stomachs, 4 in fact, and they will graze and then store that first grazing in their reticulum. Then it's regurgitated for them to ruminate on, and then it passes back into the avermectin and meson. Those are the other last 2 chambers of their rumen, and then out to their large intestine. Whereas ponies are a straight through digestive system. They are nutritionally adapted to graze on and improve species-rich grasslands, particularly our native ponies. But they're also selective grazers, and particularly they avoid their latrine areas. And with the constant inputs or repeated inputs of nutrients from their dung, the latrine areas can get quite eutrophicated, that's more fertile, and allow coarse grasses and species such as nettles to dominate there. So, in fact, that can be an issue with pony and horse grazing, and I'll come to a way round to avoid that or get over that in a little while. And as I said, they create these very short lawn areas and bare ground and can eat taller and coarser vegetation. There's been a lot of anecdotal evidence that rare and native breeds are much better for conservation grazing than what I'd call agriculturally commercial breeds. And at the top here, we have a part white cattle, and at the bottom there is a double muscle Limousin bull. And I mean, apart from the aesthetics, you can see that culturally as well, there's an advantage with having the native and rare breeds. But I have to say that I have used agriculturally commercial breeds on a lot of my conservation grazing projects very successfully. The downside to that is that on some grasslands and some habitats, particularly the wetter grasslands and calm fen meadows, the commercial animals can lose condition. And that is why, in many ways, the rare or native breeds are much better suited for that. And you can always say that, in fact, on conservation grassland, where the agronomic output isn't the primary factor that you're after, that the aesthetic and cultural benefits of having native and rare breeds is also in their advantage. So, okay, just to summarize, native breeds tend to be better suited to conservation grazing. That is also to do with the fact that where you have flocks or herds that have been reared on semi-natural grassland, their digestive systems, their microbial community in their intestines have become adapted to that. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. Generally, the native breeds that have been reared on semi-natural grasslands can cope with harsher weather conditions, lower quality forage, rougher terrain, and in particular, where you've got wet grassland. Now, I'm not going to be advocating a particular breed because I've got a vested interest. And what I'm going to be doing is giving examples that I've taken from other conservation grazers, such as Wildlife Trust, the RSPB, and National Trust. And this is really a condensation of findings of a lot of these people. Herdwick sheep, for example, are fairly easy to handle. They will tackle vegetation such as nettles and scrub. They're good mothers, need very little attention during lambing, and are good finishers. They also have a fine fleece, which is less likely to get caught in wire and bramble, which is actually quite important where you've got scrub within your site. But also to consider are Hebrideans and South Downs, Welsh Mountain, Badgerface, Shetlands, Soes. So there's a range of native sheep breeds that should also be considered for conservation grazing. Cattle. Now, I've got a picture here of a Dexter cattle, and you can see the size in relation to the handler there. And with a Dexter, it's also got a dental arcade or a bite size of around 7 to 8 centimeters. So in a way, the Dexter will create smaller scale patches than your larger breed types. Dexters are also really good, and this is evidence from a number of conservation grazers, are really good at coping with coarse, herbage, rough terrain. They're very hardy and adapt well to varying and harsh climatic conditions. And they're a dual purpose animal producing excellent beef and milk. Again, other breeds to consider, and I'm not going into this in detail because others are going to talk about breed types and their merits and dismerits for conservation grazing, but Galloways, Shetlands, English Longhorn, and British White that I've shown a picture of earlier on are breeds to consider. Now, of ponies, the Exmoor pony, a picture of which I show here, they are genetically the closest breed to our their Pleistocene ancestors, the ponies that grazed during the glacial and post-glacial period over 11,500 years ago. The Exmoor pony copes really well with coarse herbage, rough terrain. They're hardy and adapt to varying and harsh climatic conditions. But not to be outdone, the Dartmoor pony in the Konig and Shetland are also breeds worth considering. I said earlier on, conservation grazers tend to favour and do better on the diet on which they were reared. And this is for the fact that their microbial systems are adapted to the forages of semi-natural grasslands. I also suggest that you should have a closed herd. Closed herd is a herd that you rear and keep the animals, the followers, on your site throughout your grazing conservation period. If you have to bring in new stock, they should come in after having had a full health screen. Another advantage of closed herd is that closed herds that are reared on the semi-natural grasslands develop a resilience to a number of diseases, livestock diseases. For example, redwater, which is a protozoan, a babesia protozoan, seems to be less prevalent or less serious with a closed herd. I mentioned the use of chemical worm control. I know that other speakers later on are going to talk at length about this, but one of the issues around using chemical worm control, whether it's the avermectins or pyrethroids for external parasites, is that You should only use a chemical worm control if a problem has been identified. And if possible, withhold the treated animals from the grassland for as long as possible. The recommendation is for a month at least. And I'll very quickly say that here are some photographs of healthy dung. And the problem with antiparasitic drugs such as avermectins is not only do they impact on the dung degradation, but also have a dire consequence on grass and insect communities and the ecosystem stability and on the sustainability of the pasture fertility. Okay, I've mentioned earlier on briefly about the potential and advantages of mixed grazing. And here is a scene where you've got 3 sheep, ponies and cattle. And one of the great advantages, particularly say cattle and ponies, is they can be highly effective way to improve habitat condition. Ponies are both grass nibblers and scrub browsers, while cattle are typically bulk grass eaters. And these different patterns of eating can in turn create different types of habitat, ranging from short pony lawns, as I mentioned, to complex vegetation mosaics. So if you can, mixed grazing can have some really good benefits for a lot of habitat types. I've listed these 2 quotes from a paper by Stewart and Pullin from their paper they published in the Journal of Nature Conservation. Grazing intensity is more important than the species of grazer. And I go along with that entirely from the point of view that, as we've already discussed, sheep have a bad press, but largely due to the way they've been managed. And again, one of the issues as well with advising over conservation grazing is that, well, not every site, but most sites are very different to other sites. And so you need a flexible and site-based grazing management plan for your site. Okay, having said that grazing intensity is something that is not of primary importance, nevertheless, people who want to have their own stock will want to get some idea of how many animals they will require. And here in this table, I've got on the left-hand column, wildflower richness, or what I put in quotes, quality of grassland. And then in the next column, typical dominant grasses for those different grassland types. And then the annual, and LU stands for livestock units. And I'll go into livestock units and their equivalents in a moment, but just to tell you, 1 livestock unit is equivalent to a mature cow or bullock. The final right-hand column, the summer stocking rates, I think maybe I'm being a little conservative there. But anyway, these are really just guideline figures for you. Now, for very low quality grassland, which is really much of our semi-improved, agriculturally semi-improved grassland throughout much of Western Britain, dominated by ryegrass and crested dog's-tail, you can actually support over the whole year between 0.8 and 1 livestock unit per hectare. For what I'd call poor quality grassland, such as we have much of this up on Dartmoor, this is purple moorgrass or Molinia, is Latin, and mat grass, which is Narda stricta. These poor grassland types can support relatively low stocking rates over the whole year, and again, pretty low ones for the summer months. Moderate grasslands, such as the acid grasslands that we have on Dartmoor, dominated by sheep's fescue and common bent, these slightly more fertile than or supportive of higher stocking rates, but only marginally than your poor ones at 0.4 and 0.6. The high quality grasslands, these are the ones really rich in wildflowers with red fescue and crested dog's tail. I shouldn't really call them dominant, because within these high nature rich or wildflower rich grasslands, the grasses actually form a very low percentage of the total cover of those grasslands. The annual stocking rates are again higher than the other grassland to semi-improved or poor and moderate grassland types, because they're moderately more fertile, these species-rich grassland types. So they can support between 0.6, 0.8 on an annual basis, 1.2 to 1.6 over the summer months. The really species-rich calm grassland, what we call fen-meadows, in National Vegetation Classification terms, the M24 communities. But again, purple moorgrass is a key component, but should not be dominant grassland type. These fen-meadows support very low both annual and summer stocking rates. And I'll deal with this particular community in a little bit more detail just shortly. And then, of course, you've got the poor, species-poor rush pastures. Again, we have an abundance of those throughout central northern Devon. And those, in fact, have a relatively low stocking rate. Okay, livestock unit equivalents. Cattle older than 24 months and ponies older than 6 months are equivalent to 1 livestock unit. Cattle that are aged between 6 and 24 months, 0.6 of a livestock unit. 1 sheep, ewe plus a suckling lamb or a goat is equivalent to 0.15 livestock units. To put that into numbers, there are about between 6 and 7 ewes to 1 cow or bullock, a mature bullock. Okay, this picture of a wonderful calm fen meadow site that had both heath spotted orchids, lesser butterfly orchids, 9 species plus of sedges, saw-wort, devil's bit scabious, narrow bordered hawk moths, incredible site, literally humming with insects. Also supporting interesting birds such as tree pipits, grasshopper warblers, and barn owls. That site supported less than 2 cattle per hectare over the June to September period. One of the problems with such sites, fantastic sites as this, is that over the summer, after June, July, the actual forage value of such grassland declines significantly. I've actually pasted out the statistical values there just because they perhaps confuse. The line is very indicative of the fall in the quality. And the quality here is, we call it the metabolizable energy value, which is used by agronomists, agriculturists, as a measure of the nutritional value of the forage that the animals are presented with. This is for purple moorgrass, Molinia caerulea leaf. And because it's a deciduous plant, it starts to have its leaves senescing late summer and losing their quality. So you can see clearly why stock on calm grasslands lose condition. Just to say that our animals we used for a number of projects on calm grassland were commercial animals, and we struggled to get some of the animals at barely maintenance levels. The average growth rates were about a quarter of what we would achieve on agricultural pastures. So a real compromise in the agronomic value of these grasslands, but that is irrelevant from the conservation point of view, because as my previous slide showed, what we're about is creating those fantastic flower-rich meadows. And here's another example. This is the hay aftermath that was grazed by cattle in the autumn period between September and October. So conservation grazing targeted at a particular time of the year, and this wonderful meadow supported 3 to 5 mature cows or 3 to 5 livestock units per hectare over the September to October period. Absolutely fantastic. This grassland, by the way, again, was literally noisy with insects, grasshoppers and crickets and others. Now, when to graze. Now, what I'm going to talk about this, having said that really your objective is to monitor the structure of your grasslands and either shift animals out or get your grazers to move animals out when they're grazing too tightly or conditions are getting wet and they're starting to poach. But this is really, when to graze is a guide to how to use conservation grazing to achieve certain ends, such as control of dominant species. such as tall grass, Brachypodium pinnatum, mat grass, that's Nada stricta, rushes, and also scrub seedlings and ragwort particularly using sheep grazing, and then purple moorgrass. So spring grazing, February to May, is really useful tool to control these aggressive or potentially dominant species. The downside is if you do this for more than 1 to 2 years, you can eliminate early species such as hay rattle, and you can also damage a wide range of invertebrates. And of course, there's the risk of trampling eggs and chicks of ground nesting birds. Summer grazing, okay, is a useful tool to control tall growing species such as meadowsweet and to control scrub and tree sapling invasion of your site. It also, summer grazing allows less nutrient buildup from animal dung due to a greater microbial activity from soil warm conditions, providing obviously the soil doesn't get too dry and cause the microbial communities to slow down their processing of the dung and manures. They also have dry soils, generally speaking, so lower poaching risk. The disadvantages are high stocking densities periodically during the summer months can remove flowers, prevent seed set, and can, and this is a serious issue, eliminate annual and biennial plant species. And in turn, this can also eliminate or damage a range of invertebrates dependent upon structural and plant species diversity. Summer grazing can produce a rather simple specialist short turf fauna, invertebrate fauna. Okay, autumn grazing, probably one which I've already shown you a picture of with that wonderful flourish meadow, is the least damaging time for sensitive invertebrates. Most of the grass and plant species are finished flowering and set seed. However, there are some of the later flowering species, such as devil's bit scabious, which grazing animals can actually target and graze out. And of course, the other thing I've mentioned is forage digestibility will have declined markedly. And many species, such as the coarser stemia grasses, will be rejected, and that will allow them to have competitive advantages. I talked earlier on about selectivity. We actually graze that lovely calm grassland with cattle. And the first year we did it, we used relatively young bullocks. They went into the grassland and it was absolute picture with heath-spotted orchids. The following day, I was horrified because I went to check on the animals and saw virtually no orchid flowers remaining. And what had happened was these animals which had gone in had seen these rather peculiar, novel features within their grassland, gone over, licked them, tasted them, found that the nectaries were full of sugars and decided, wow, and grazed a lot because that was a really tasty morsel from the graze. It was, I call it the ice cream effect. And we learned our lesson very quickly. We only used animals which were habituated to such grasslands, didn't focus so much on the flowers, and this was mainly mature, much more mature animals. Young animals, inquisitive, and that was part of the problem. They were intrigued by all this smorgasbord that they had in front of them, whereas the older animals just got on with grazing and bulk grazing. Okay, winter grazing. Most grass and herbs are dormant and not directly affected, and it's less damaging for invertebrates that overwinter in the tussock bases. And a modest trampling in the winter breaks up the litter layer and exposes bare ground to allow seedling recruitment. Heavy trampling may lead to poaching and weed infestation. When I talk about heavy trampling, that's probably principally around gateways, walkways through, or animal trackways through, and around camping areas. So there will be localized problems associated and can be associated with winter grazing. And the other trouble with winter grazing is localized trampling can remove the litter layer, which is an important overwintering habitat for invertebrates. It's also less likely, winter grazing is less likely to control tall grasses. And the other downside is stock may lose condition and you may need to supplementary feed. Now, grazing systems, one size doesn't fit all. And again, the main issue is that you need to be looking at achieving what you want from your grassland. And you can use either continuous or rotational or mob grazing. I haven't any experience of mob grazing myself, but I know many people who've used mob grazing quite successfully as conservation grazers. But I've put arrows against the ones which I feel are the most effective in conservation grazing. Those are the ones where you can vary the sucking rate through the summer rather than actually moving the whole herd or flock off. Varying the rotational grazing has a problem because it needs more fencing. Or if you are going to vary the paddock size to moderate your grazing pressure, or you can move the animals on. The frequency of the rotation and rest period is how you can moderate your grazing intensity. With continuous grazing, I use what's called a put and take system, whereby spare paddocks or an amenable livestock supplier can have the animals that you feel you need to reduce or take out to moderate the grazing pressure. This has been a very rapid run through or introduction to conservation grazing, and I'm more than happy to answer any questions that you might have, and also talk a little bit more if you're interested in some of the forage attributes of conservation grassland. Anyway, thank you very much.
Oh, thank you, Jerry. That was really informative. Right, I'm going to introduce you to our next speaker as Anna David. Anna worked on the Devon Greater Horseshoe Bat project with farmers to reduce the use of ivermectin and other worming products commonly used in Devon, which impact on dung beetles and other dung fauna. So Anna, over to you.
Yes, hello everybody. Right, I'm going to try and share my screen. Hopefully it will go okay. Actually, I think that's over to Tracy, isn't it? Let me know, Tracy, if I should do anything different. Just going to wait for you to share it.
Yeah, you just need to get your PowerPoint up, Anna.
Right.
And then I can fill it in. Here, right.
Sorry.
Okay.
Is that all visible?
That's all good.
Cool. Okay. Right. Okay. Cool. So yeah, hello everybody. I'm Anna, and I previously worked on the Devon Greater Horseshoe Bat project, which ran from 2015 to just the beginning of this year. Yeah, it was run through the Devon Wildlife Trust and other partners. And so I'm just going to sort of summarize really some of the learning that came out of that in terms of parasite management, some of the work that we did with farmers, and some of the information that we were trying to put out there into the wider sort of spheres, I suppose. And during the project, I trained as an animal medicines advisor. And so that enabled me to go out there and talk with farmers about some of these issues. And Jerry sort of touched on in his talk briefly about the role of anthelmintics. I'm just going to expand on that a little bit and talk a bit about the importance of dung beetles and the sort of knock-on effect on other wildlife in the food chain, and also a little bit about some of the things that we can do to sort of reduce the impacts. So firstly, I'm just going to sort of summarize, what's going on out there. So obviously livestock, famously cattle in particular, produce a lot of dung. And so they will be spreading that out there as a resource for all the wildlife, which is very kind of them. But unfortunately, there is something that can get in the way. So certain anthelmintics or wormers, when they are sort of administered to livestock, can find their way quite easily into dung. Sometimes in quite a pure form, and then that can have knock-on impacts on dung beetle and other dung fauna populations. Really, in some instances, landscapes can become quite sort of sterile for dung beetles. And then that can have knock-on effects, again, higher up in the food chain. So bats and other birds, which will be feeding on these species, there's fewer of them in the landscape, so there's less food as a resource for these other species, and so their populations are impacted as well. So so the use of these anthelmintics at one point in the sort of food chain that do have knock-on effects. It's not the same as something like DDT, for example, which bioaccumulates up through the food chain. It's thought that these products don't really do that because they sort of act as an insecticide quite specifically. So far, the science suggests that it's actually just a case of reducing populations rather than it being like a toxic effect. And a bit more about the dung food web. So dung is basically an ecosystem in itself. It might not be the most glamorous of all the ecosystems out there, but nonetheless, it does form a really strong basis for a lot of our wildlife. So if we start off in the centre with a lovely dung pat, then you can sort of build on from there. So most famously, probably dung feeding beetles, the dung beetles. So they will be eating actually the liquid part of dung, which is why they sort of favour cow pats over things like sheep poo, mainly because it's more liquid. Mixed diet flies, so they will be using dung as part of their sort of wider diet. Fungi as well, so there are many sort of coprophyte fungi species that rely on dung as a means to reproduce and sort of live out their life cycles. Dung feeding flies, so the yellow dung fly, quite famous. The adults don't actually really eat the dung, they more use it as a sort of location for mating, and then they lay the eggs into the dung, and then the larvae will be eating the dung. And then the predatory beetles, so they will be sort of predating on other parts of larvae and different smaller insects that are also living within the dung. Fungivorous beetles will so yeah, we're building up here, so parasitic wasps and predatory flies as well. So those are just some of the species that you would expect to find in the dung, and then they form the basis for other species higher up in the food chain. So my focus for the last 5 years was very much on the greater horseshoes, which they do rely on dung beetles, certainly sort of late summer. But other species of bat too. So lesser horseshoes, they really like eating those yellow dung flies. So if you see them out in the fields, then that's always quite good news. But other species of bat too, so serotine, noctule, for example, they really like to eat some of the dung fauna too. Corvids, so for example, the lovely chough, they love to pick apart dung. That's a really important thing for them, to be out there, sort of nice low graze grassland with some really good quality dung. And swallows as well. So swallows really like feeding over pasture that's rich in dung. And I often think that if you find a field and you've got loads of swallows flying over it, then you're probably going to find it full of bats as well in the evening. So so all these different species relying on the dung life cycle. So we don't usually think of dung beetles necessarily as a really important thing in the UK. I think most people in our country will think of dung beetles as this, which are these huge dung beetle species that we'll see in David Attenborough documentaries, devouring elephant dung in about 2 minutes. But yeah, most of our species look a bit more like this. I mean, these aren't actually life size. So we usually find them just a few centimetres to a few millimetres. But some of them really beautiful. So the geotrupes, the bottom right-hand corner beetle there, if you turn them over, then, and sometimes you do find them just upside down on their back, then they're really beautiful. They've got this sort of bluey, purpley iridescence to them, which is sort of unmistakable, really. But yeah, so we've got a big variety of different insects, some different dung beetles. But what we don't have in the UK, and is what people usually think of as what a dung beetle does, is we don't have these rollers. So the rollers are the ones that will take some of the dung and they'll roll it off, and then they'll sort of bury it underground. What we have in the UK are the dwellers and the tunnelers. So the dwellers, they're the ones that actually spend their whole life inside the dung itself. So for example, the Aphodius genus, they look a bit like a tic-tac kind of shaped dung beetle. And they're quite abundant as well. So especially in late summer, you'll find quite a few aphodious dung beetles and a healthy dung pat. They will spend all their life sort of actually in in the pat itself. They'll mate and they'll lay their eggs, and the hatchlings will come up sort of the next season. They only really lay one brood a year. And also the tunnelers as well. So the larger dung beetles, so the sort of geotrutes and the Onthophagus genus of dung beetles, they tend to create these dung balls, but then they'll tunnel them right down quite quickly underground. Maybe they'll take them, maybe a centimetre away from the dung pat, but in general, it will go down under the ground, under the dung pat. And then they'll create these brood balls, and that's what they'll lay their eggs in. And then a little larvae will start eating away at the brood ball, and eventually the next year it will emerge as an adult. So in our country, that's what we expect to find. And quite often, I'm sure some of you will have come across little holes under dung pats, and if you dig underneath that, you'll find a little brood ball full of a little larvae, hopefully. So there's all kinds of fun cartoons out there about dung beetles, but so every parent dung beetle will give their child a little brood ball if they're a certain species anyway. So dung beetles, there are thought to be about 60 species in the UK, and they're thought to be probably the world's strongest animal as well, which I think is a really nice little fact about dung beetles. So equivalent of a human pushing 6 double-decker buses, which is quite an impressive feat, as I'm sure you'll agree. But probably the best thing, in terms of things that you can talk to other people about to get them enthusiastic, especially when you're talking to maybe quite commercial farmers, is that there was a study conducted by Dr. Sarah Bainan back in 2015, and she found from various calculations that she sort of estimated that the value of dung beetles to the cattle industry in the UK was about £367 million a year. It's probably a bit higher than that, but it's very hard to quantify these things. And it's thought that that's because of the sort of aeration of the dung beetles actually digging down into the soil, the nutrient cycling capacity of bringing dung down and helping it enter back into the soil system. And then actually the removal of the dung from the surface of the grass, allowing the grass to come back up as well. So you're actually increasing the area of pasture that can actually be productive. So there are lots of ways that dung beetles are providing us a service, if you like. However, they are thought to be in decline. So about 25% of the UK's dung beetles are considered nationally rare. Granted, there aren't that many people counting them. So some of them might just be really quite undercounted, but nonetheless, it's definitely a trend. 4 species are thought to potentially have become extinct in the last 50 years. And so at the moment, it is quite a downward trend from what it looks like. The sorts of habitats that they are found in are the sorts of habitats that we are losing. So species-rich grassland, sort of well-managed woodlands, cattle graze pasture, and they like these habitats with these sort of nice networks of tall shrubby hedgerows. But probably the thing that's had the biggest impact on them is the use of livestock wormers or anthelmintics. And these products are actually quite useful, obviously. They're very key to sort of modern agriculture and livestock welfare. And when used correctly, they can have really important benefits. In the UK, it's thought that ivermectin is the most popular livestock anthelmintic. It's really powerful, and it's also something that's known as a broad spectrum product. So it not only sort of knocks out some of the internal parasites, but also some of the external parasites as well. So instead of having to take in cattle or sheep and treat them numerous times, you only really have to do it once. So it's sort of in some ways thought to be better for the livestock because it's less stress. But actually the sort of the ramifications of using this product to a large extent is quite large. So various studies have been conducted to try and work out what the impact is. And it's been found that actually between about 62 and 98% of this product that is administered into an animal just literally gets dumped out onto a pasture. And that's quite a strong insecticide, really, to be just being passed out unmetabolized into our ecosystem, and therefore, carrying on being an insecticide in the wider landscape and impacting on all that dung fauna that we looked at earlier in a previous slide. So avermectins, and the ivermectin in particular, gets a lot of the sort of the stick, I suppose, but recent studies have actually shown that this problem isn't unique to ivermectin and the sort of wider avermectin group of wormers. So a recent study up in the Inner Hebrides, which was sort of funded by the RSPB, had found that there's quite an adverse effect of both deltamethrin, which is a spot on for flies and ticks, and triclobendazole, which is used for all stages of fluke. So that's a really useful product. And they were trying to work out why the chough population up in, I think it was the Isle of Egg. I can't remember which of the islands it was, but it was one of the islands that the RSPB had basically banned the use of ivermectins, and they were hoping that that would have had a knock-on effect on the chough population up there. And they couldn't work out why the chough population was still in decline. And so they commissioned this study, and everyone was really quite surprised that the impact of deltamethrin and triclobendazole was having this impact. And when those two products were used at the same time, it was up to 80% mortality of some of these sort of dipterid species, so the fly species in the dung. So it was a much higher impact than people had previously thought. And this is quite a complex thing to try and pick apart, because obviously the use of insecticides for ticks and flies and fluke is really important, especially in areas, near Devon where we are. Because it's quite a wet part of the country and it's quite mild, and these things are going to be pests for a long time. But there is help out there to sort of give advice about what products are thought to be less toxic than others. So this is a nice handout that you can download quite easily from the Dung Beetle Direct website, which is a really great, just like clear a demonstration of which are the most harmful and which are the least harmful. And also there's a new organisation that's recently been set up called Dung Beetles for Farmers. So do have a little look on both of those websites. So that's Dung Beetles Direct and Dung Beetles for Farmers. And they've got a whole host of information and sort of tips and things for trying to get around some of the issues that are associated with some of these products if you have to use them. So yeah, just to try and summarize some of the sort of some of the more problematic ones. So some of you might be familiar with Dectomax. So that's the product name of doramectin, and so that one is probably the most toxic to dung beetles. So if you can avoid that, please do. And Ivermec, which is ivermectin, obviously we've spoken about that one. And then so Cydectin or moxidectin is usually considered the sort of better alternative of this class of wormer. And they don't seem to have such a big impact on the dwellers of the dung pats, but they do seem to still have an impact on the tunnelers. So Cydectin or moxidectin still has an impact, but less so than the other ones in that group. One of the other things that's kind of going on alongside these issues to do with the sort of biodiversity impacts of the use of these wormers is that these worming products have been used a little bit too much potentially in the past and still now, and sometimes used in a way that results in this sort of quicker build-up of resistance to these products. So much like we've experienced the sort of build-up in resistance to antibiotics in humans, a similar process going on for these anthelmintics as well. So there are various recommendations, and I haven't got time to sort of go into them properly, but here's just like a few things to sort of consider and go off and do a bit more research on if you're not already familiar with. I'm sure some of you already are. But yeah, trying to leave around 10% of a flock or a herd untreated. If you're trying to treat a whole herd for, say, your roundworm bird, and if there's some of the like 10% that you think actually they're looking the healthiest, try and leave them untreated, because then you'll know that there'll be some worms that are not actually going to be resistant to the product that you're using. Leave livestock on dirty pasture for a few days post-treatment before moving on to clean pasture. Obviously, Jerry was talking earlier about how great it is to keep them indoors as much as you can. And absolutely, if you can do that, that is the best thing to do, to just try and prevent any of that dung going out onto the pasture. But I know that sometimes that isn't always something that's possible. So if you're treating your livestock on a field that already has worms on it, then it's best to try and keep them on that after they've been wormed again, so that they can pick up some of the non-resistant worms before they move on. And then calibrating equipment and weighing, making sure you quarantine stock coming onto a farm and treating them before they go out onto pasture. All these things are really best practice to try and reduce some of the big problems with resistance that are building up. And if you're interested in finding out more about some of those issues, and if you're not already familiar with these websites, then Cows and Scops are really great things to just try and have a look at, really, because they're brilliant resources on some of these issues. And then other things to do with grazing management. So again, this is just a really basic overview of it, but just trying to identify the low risk and high risk pasture for worms is useful for predicting and managing worm burden. So, reducing the need to use these products in the first place is the key thing here. Cross grazing with other livestock and older age classes is a really great thing to do. So sometimes, sheep might clean up a pasture of some of the worms that are infective to cattle and vice versa. So trying to mix up what you're grazing with is a good way to try and reduce the worm burden. Aftermath grazing and fresh lays are much less likely to be infective. And so again, you're much less likely to have to use these products. And then countryside stewardship can help fund infrastructure to enable this management as well. So if you already are in a scheme, you're familiar with the fact that you can then apply for things like fencing and troughs and any of that sort of infrastructure that can help to increase the ability to manage your grazing, so you can move animals around a pasture and meadows much more easily. Fecal egg counts, especially when it comes to sheep, are really handy to be able to work out, is there a burden? Is there a lot of worm eggs in the feces of the livestock? And do you need to treat or do you not need to treat? So when it comes to cattle, it's a part of a sort of a wider picture because it's a little bit less reliable, but certainly for sheep, it's a really useful thing. You can either do it yourself using a kit, or you can send up a sample to maybe like Mole Valley Farmers or another organisation that can do it for you. But of course, this is part of a bigger picture. So other practices out there, which Jerry also spoke about really brilliantly, things like, species-rich pasture or herbal lays, which have got a brilliant combination of different species of plant, which will be providing different minerals and nutrients to the livestock, will make them a bit more resilient to actually coming down with some of these illnesses in the first place. And also sometimes they will contain these bioactive forages, such as chicory and sometimes plantain. And these different plants are known to contain these sort of natural anthelmintics. Potentially it's the tannin that actually is reducing the ability of the worms to reproduce in the gut. But sometimes, it's not really known exactly what those pathways are, but certainly increasing the diversity of swards is a really great way to try and reduce the burden of worms. Mob grazing, rotational management and grazing planning also, these are really important things to try and reduce the likelihood of worms sort of getting into the system in the first place. The larval stage of some of these sort of internal gut worms, they tend to stay quite low down on the grass itself. And so if you're grazing on longer grasses, then there's less chance of them picking up the worms in the first place. So that's it from me. It was a bit of a whistle-stop tour through that subject, but yeah, hopefully I've given you some good ideas of places to try and check out in the future to sort of learn a bit more if you're interested.
Thank you, Anna. That was fascinating. The tunnelers and the dwellers. I've learned a lot.
Great.
And the food web. Thank you. And I think you've provided us with some links for people, haven't you?
I can send them to you.
If you send them to me,
yeah,
because I'll email people after the talk and with all the links and they can watch the talk again. So yeah, if you could give me those, that'd be brilliant. Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
Right, and our next speaker is Desley White. And Desley, with her husband John, set up a conservation grazing enterprise called Cows in Clover, based in the Avon Valley in South Devon. They use native cattle to graze grassland and wood pasture for the benefit of wildlife. So do check out their Facebook page, Cows in Clover. Over to you, Desley.
Great, thank you, Donna. Great, thanks very much, everyone. So probably firstly, I should start by saying that neither John or myself have a background in farming or in ecology or conservation. And although I've kept goats for many decades, we've only started keeping cattle about 5 or so years ago. And we fell into conservation grazing very much by accident when we got involved with the Devon Wildlife Trust's Avon Valley project, which is a scheme that seeks to bring together the community within the Avon Valley to restore wildflower meadows and to put people in touch with each other who are interested in changing their land and making it much more biodiverse. And when Lynn Kenterdine first came to visit us, she noticed that we had cattle and asked us if we were interested in doing any conservation grazing. And we said that we were, and it's sort of taken off from there, really. So we started off with 3 cattle. I think we had 3 cattle at that point. We've now got 36, and Cows in Clover has grown substantially over that time. But it's still very much, we started it as a hobby, and although now we registered as a business, we both do still work, and we fit the cattle and the grazing around our jobs. Profit isn't the primary objective for what we do. However, the enterprise does need to pay its way, and we do that by selling beef. So we provide a grazing service that we don't get paid for, but in return we get to feed our animals a lot of grass and give them a fantastic quality of life. So how we work has really come about in a very kind of trial and error way, in response to the land that we've got available to us, and what we do is sort of what we do at the moment, and I don't know that we'll always do it this way. You know, it kind of flexes around the land that comes along, really. However, we've got some fantastic sites that are large and seem to be stable, that kind of allow us to to do some planning and to sort of have the confidence to actually carry the number of cattle that we've got at the moment. So we do hope to carry on growing. We don't want to get massively much bigger because we've got to get around and check all these cattle and alongside doing our jobs. So I think we'll probably reach a maximum at around sort of 42 or so next year. So we only have 4.5 acres of our own, and 1.5 acres of that is a wildflower meadow in restoration with the Avon Valley project. But overall, we'll be grazing about 250 acres this year on 24 different sites. Next year, it's likely to be around 450 acres. We tend to operate, very roughly speaking, with 1 head of cattle per 10 acres over the whole year. And I think I'm right in saying that that's not actually a million miles away from the extensive grazing stock density of 0.3 livestock units per hectare, which I've read of in a couple of places as an extensive grazing rate. So the largest of our sites are the Woodland Trust Avon Valley Woods, so they're woods and wood pasture. So that's the picture here that you can see. But we also, and we do have year-round use of that. However, we do come off in the winter to do our other winter grazing, which lets that land have the opportunity to sort of to get over any worm burden that it might have, and just to sort of, so we're not kind of making the paths muddy, because it's sort of popular place for walkers. We also use South Effort Marsh, the Devon Wildlife Trust's nature reserve, and that's an area that the public don't have access to, so that's a really useful site for us for summer grazing. And we can also keep a bull down there with the cows and heifers, so and know that, you know, they'll all be safe down there. And we also use Brimbridge Farm, which is a new nature reserve in the Avon Valley. So we have sort of 5 kind of stable summer grazing sites. That takes us up to sort of round about August. After that, we will have another 19 or so sites, which will take us into January, February time. The smallest site that we graze is about 3 acres. And we kind of reckon on 6 cattle per acre per week for the winter grazing that we do. So we arrive on a site, stay there till the grass is gone, and then move the cattle off to another site. So there's a lot of moving around for the cattle. They move around in groups of 6 because that's how many we can get in a trailer. Occasionally numbers sort of fluctuate a little bit, and we've got a couple of smaller teams out at the moment. So we do a lot of moving about, a lot within our winter grazing, and I think probably one of the most useful things we do is graze down really difficult to access sites on rough and steep land that you can't really get equipment into doing very easily, and turn that forage into a really fantastic food source for people. We use temporary land association contracts with the Animal and Plant Health Agency to link us the temporary sites that we go to our own holding. So it means that from a TB testing point of view, we don't have to TB test prior to moving. So we can do that on a site that, as long as that site isn't occupied by other cattle and it's within a 10-mile radius of home. Okay, so it's important, it's key for our management that the cattle are mostly out all year. We don't house any cattle over winter. However, we do have a barn that pregnant mothers can use when they come back onto our land. So the cattle are out all year without any additional feed, apart from a supplement lick, a mineralised and molassed lick tub. So the cattle do well on this, with some provisos, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a moment. They're hardy, and you know they can grow well on this kind of lifestyle. So as the smaller winter grazing sites come to an end in December and January, we'll start to gather the cattle together at Brimbridge Farm, and they'll graze down the meadows there. But there's also a fantastic cattle handling system there, so we can do things like our annual TB testing there, which will be biannual for next year. So you know, it's a big sort of cattle handling system and crushes and things like that. So, and we can do routine jobs like hoof trimming as well. So after TB testing, then in February, the pregnant cattle will come home, and any others that we haven't got sites for, but most of the rest will go back out. They'll go into the Avon Valley woods, or they might go out to other grazing sites, and we can still be finishing up our winter grazing in right up until the end of February. So so we try and arrange our calving for March, ideally, and so the cattle will be at home during March, and they can use the barn that we've got if necessary. And if we have if there's any really bad weather as well, we can bring the cattle home and feed them from the barn there. So we've got 15 breeding cows and heifers, and we breed them in 2 groups. And this is in response to, partly in response to a shortage of land for us that's safe for the young calves, that's got grass on in the spring, that, you know, isn't sort of public access, for instance, and it's close to home, and it's you know, it's you know, sort of suitable for calves from that point of view. But we don't have very much of that. And the other thing that we found is that because we allow the calves to stay with the mothers and wean themselves, so they'll be, the following winter the calves will still be with the mothers when they're winter grazing. If their mother still is pregnant at that point, then they're really not going to keep up any condition at all, and they'll, you know, they start to lose condition. And so we don't you know, we don't expect them to breed every year for us, but they breed on alternate years. So we've got these two sort of teams of breeding cattle. So the mothers who are going to go to the bull would at this point and then go down to South Efford Marsh, and the mums and the calves will go to our summer grazing field that we rent in April, and we hope at that point there'll be some rain and the grass will start growing. I should add that the pregnant mothers at home will be eating hay that we've made the summer before. So we discovered very quickly that our rented field that we're lucky enough to be able to rent close by to us is actually a fantastic wildflower meadow itself. And so we have to be very sort of careful about the way that we graze it. And we don't want to, you know, obviously, you know, sort of intensively graze it. So how we manage it is we've divided it into three. So the top third of the field we'll leave to grow for, and the field's about just under 9 acres. So the sort of top 3 acres is we leave to grow for this, you know, fantastic wildflower meadows, and masses of orchids, and had skylarks nesting in it this year. So we'll leave that until August, or if we need to make hay from it, we'll do that a little bit earlier. We prefer not to make hay though. I'd rather leave it longer and let the cattle graze it down, and it just sort of lets the insects sort of stay longer on it. You know, we would always rather let the cattle eat the grass rather than make it into hay. Making hay is a lot of hard work. We don't have a great deal of time. And if we've made hay, we then need to feed it to them too, which is more work. Again, much easier, just let the cattle eat it themselves. So, so the bottom 2/3 of the field are divided in half, and we graze them alternately. So this was last year, and we had about 6 cattle and a couple of calves on it, and they would sort of graze it 3 weeks on and 3 weeks off, and we just sort of kept swapping over, and that was about right to let the grass grow back, and to feed them for 3 weeks on the other half of it. It is a compromise really, but you know, we do need to feed the cattle, and the cattle do need to be somewhere whilst the wildflowers are growing. It's, you know, it's quite important for us to have kind of a mix of available sites, so when, you know, we're not kind of on too much intensively on one piece of land. So I should just add, we don't routinely worm the cattle, but we will worm them in response to a need. And the only worm problem that we've had has been quite a few years ago now. We had a problem with lung worms from we were very short of land unexpectedly, and we ended up with a lungworm infection, which we dealt with. But you know, obviously, we don't. If we keep the animals moving around, then you know that shouldn't happen again. So so this is our. So I mentioned earlier that we were part of the Avon Valley project, and we've used the cattle as part of our seed sowing on our lower meadow. And this is before we got involved with the Avon Valley project. This is what the grass was like to begin with. So it was sort of semi-improved grassland. It was quite nice grass, really. It's not very much ryegrass in it or anything. But we got involved with the Avon Valley project, and we, for 2 years, in 2017 and 2018, we sowed yellow rattle-rich seeds, which were donated to us. And we grazed the grass down really hard beforehand we harrowed it with a chain harrow, hand sowed the seeds in December time, and let the cattle just kind of walk around on the field and just tread it all in, and which then after 2 years had just dramatically had changed the grass. And so in 2020 we had just an amazing yellow rattle crop, and a similar one in 2019 as well, and we were able to be a yellow rattle seed donor site for the Avon Valley project after that. So we didn't do anything else, and then this year we had a much more diverse sward in the meadow, and really, you know, it was really exciting to see. It was incredibly vibrant, and, you know, full of grasshoppers and caterpillars and froglets in it, and lots of hedgehogs and evidence of grass snakes using it as well. And John even saw a polecat as well this year. So in order to make it a little bit more diverse and sort of encourage some later flowering plants, I handpicked some seeds from our summer grazing meadow, and here I'm just hand sowing them into the field. This is just very recently. So the grass isn't properly grazed down yet at this point, but I wanted to do it whilst the cattle were in there, and I'm sort of just putting the seeds into their little hoof divots where it's just going to be touching the soil, and then it'll just be treaded in. So our cattle spend quite a lot of time in woodland, and it was a real it was amazing for us to just see how much they do love being in the woods, and they love the shelter and being able to hide themselves away. They're cool in the summer, and very protected in the winter. And I'd say it's probably their most favourite environment to be in. This is Penstave Copse in South Brent. They are very prone to ticks, particularly in woodland, but we found that garlic lick tubs do keep the tick numbers down, which was, you know, and can be quite sort of a dramatic difference as well. So what they do in woodland, so here they are in the Avon Valley woods. Well, they just kind of perform a general thuggery around trees. So the Avon Valley woods are millennium woods, so they're very young woods, and the Woodland Trust wanted the cattle to go in and just sort of kind of just bash them about a bit really, and make it much more diverse and a sort of more kind of dynamic structure within the woods. The cattle absolutely love willow. Here they're barking willow and they're eating it, but they also will break trees by Dumbledore here with his horns will just kind of reach up, pull a tree down, and the other cattle will just come around and just eat it. And it's quite shocking to see sometimes. And this little birch tree here has obviously suffered at their hands, but I think, you know, the little oak tree that's behind it will actually really benefit from having the you know, foliage opened up around it. So we use trackers, digital animal trackers, on the cattle in the woods and in other areas as well. And this is from a very practical point of view. We'd need to find them, and, you know, these woods are huge, and we're walking around, you know, and we haven't got a great deal of time. So the trackers tell us where they are, so we can they're very, very useful for us. And they also provide information too, like these heat maps of the areas that the cattle hang out in the woods, and so we can see where they're spending the most time, but also the trackways that they're starting to make within the woods are evident in this diagram as well. So there's a few areas here that haven't got any data for, so I think these are kind of like satellite shadows where they're not able to get a signal from the trackers for those particular areas because it's a very steep valley. So and we can also kind of see where the cattle are. So I can just kind of zoom in on if one of the team has got a tracker on for the small kind of herds that are out at the moment. I can just zoom in and see that I can just check they're in the field that they're meant to be in, rather than elsewhere, which is quite reassuring. So although we started as a hobby, we do need to sort of pay our way, and the cattle need to pay their way. And we'd have quite a few expenses, just routine equipment and insurance and that kind of thing. We don't get any farm subsidies. And as we use more and more things like trackers and no fence trackers, which we want to start using as well, our costs are sort of continuing to go up. So I think it's quite possible that we will start needing to charge for the use of things like trackers, but also for some of the fencing that we do on some of the sites as well that can be really labour intensive. So we aim to give our animals a really good long life before we need to kill them for beef, and it's with absolute minimum of 5 years, but we're aiming for 15 years plus as our herd gets older. We just kind of give the animal the best life it can, really. So top tips I would say is to handle the animals a lot, because it's very much easier to work with them, and if they have a cut or something, you just need to just check them for anything. If you can get right up to them, and it's very much easier to do. We've brought in quite a few cattle in the last year or so, and some of them have been really unhandled. They're really flighty, and it's really much more stressful for them to be out and about on these sort of different sites, with lots and lots of rapid changes. In small teams, smaller groups than they would be in naturally. So, it's all quite stressful for them. So we try to encourage the animals to be really calm and steady around people. It's really important for the public access sites as well. We also try to identify the leaders that there are, and to try and spread them around amongst the different groups, so that the herds are much steadier, much more content if they've got a strong leader. And if that leader's tame as well and will come when it's called and bring the others with it, then it really helps to make our life much, much easier. And I think just drawbacks, we need to be flexible to what we've got available to us, and it can be insecure. We've got fantastic support from the Devon Wildlife Trust and the Woodland Trust who've given us really good kind of land that we can use at the times of year that we really need it. So that's helped, and the Avon Valley project has lent us can lend us a bowser and fencing too, which really helps. It can be a little bit nerve-wracking at times. We have lots of unpredictable problems, just worrying about feeding everything and the weather. Is it going to rain? Is it going to snow? That's sort of, there's lots and lots for us to worry about. But on the other hand, it allows us to farm. This kind of enterprise has allowed us to farm without actually having a farm of our own, which has been enormously life enhancing for myself and John. Okay, and just to finish up, I just wanted to mention the Rare Breeds Survival Trust Grazing Animals project, because it's a great source of resources. And there's a forum, and they do courses and things as well. So I do recommend getting in touch with that. And here's our links. And as Donna says, yes, follow us on Facebook, and we keep an email list, for mailing list for our beef boxes when we have them. So please get in touch if you're interested in buying some beef as well. Okay, that's it. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Desley. That was really interesting, and it's so fascinating to find out about cows grazing in woodlands, because it's something that actually we don't really hear about that much. So yeah, really interesting. Thank you. Now we have run on a bit. We are coming up to 9, but the speakers, we've got some really interesting questions that have come in. Are you all happy to run on for another 15 minutes?
Yes.
You okay, Anna?
Yep.
Yep. Fantastic. Okay. Right. The first question, this will be for Jerry. It's for Jerry. Stephen Powell's asked the pros and cons of grazing versus cutting in terms of the effect on meadow fauna. Could you say a little bit about that?
Well, grazing, you can create much finer scale patchworks and mosaics using grazing animals than cutting. I guess the other downside with cutting is that it will be, well, whether you've got petrol or whatever motor, you're using up fuel rather than using the animal. But I just think that the grazing animal can create such brilliant structures, whereas with cutting, it's labor intensive and time consuming. Why use a mower when you can use livestock? Sorry, that's rather brief, but it also comes around to other issues as well, which have been asked about. But I'll go back to Donna for the next question.
Well, I'd just like to pick up on that and say, you know, is your experience then that cutting for hay, and people are cutting for hay for if they need the fodder, but also people are cutting for hay because they don't need the fodder, because the I suppose the belief is that actually cut meadows produce more floristic diversity, and then you'll get more pollinators, but obviously you also then are cutting a lot of insects, or it's cataclysmic for insects. So is that your understanding that, or belief, that we get more flowers when we cut? I mean,
that's a very interesting point, Donna, and maybe I was a little bit flippant over sort of downgrading cutting versus grazing. Yes, I mean, a lot of our really, really rich, wildflower-rich meadows or grasslands are cut for hay. But thinking about it, hay cutting systems now are very dramatic. Unless you leave a swathe of grass uncut in the middle or around the edge of the field, the general tendency is you cut the whole field down, and it's dramatic loss of habitat for insects and invertebrates. But I guess that mob grazing probably can actually have a similar effect to cutting, because it can be quite a dramatic removal of all the forage there. And going back to the issue about hay meadows, I showed that picture of an amazing grassland, which was a hay meadow that was then aftermath grazed. And the big problem with that was, I think the hay cutting had quite a dramatic effect on certain invertebrate groups, such as grasshoppers and crickets. If they'd had a slow start to the season, a cold, wet spring, grasshoppers and crickets weren't able to finish their juvenile stages, life cycles, before along came the mower and cut down the whole system. So, whereas within a grazed pasture, and there's lots of incredibly rich grazed pastures, thinking of a lot of the dales and the chalk grasslands, limestone grasslands, the fen-meadows, the culm grasslands, all grazed and all producing wonderful richness of wildflowers. I'm not saying we give up. We shouldn't. We should continue with haymaking where the pastures or the grasslands are adapted and useful for hay cutting. But just bear in mind, they are a dramatic change in habitat for the invertebrate communities, in particular certain groups which have to produce a number of juvenile stages before they're mature enough to lay eggs for the next generation.
Right. Thank you, Jerry. That was a very comprehensive answer. Just following on, there's a question from Anushka. Are methane emissions more or less the same on these conservation pastures? I think that's talking about the different livestock that you use. Or no, that's talking about a species-rich grassland. If you've got a cow on a species-rich grassland versus on a improved. Emissions.
Actually, it's a quite a complex issue, because methane emissions are related to the forage quality that the animal consumes. The lower the forage quality and the longer the time, the residence time in the intestines of the animals, the greater there is the opportunity for the methogenic bacteria and bugs to actually work on that forage and produce methane, which is then belched out by the animal. The upside is that the biodiversity benefits of grazing of semi-natural grasslands probably outweigh the methane emissions, because as I showed that slide on the table with the livestock units, the actual numbers of animals that you need to graze means that there are relatively few animals compared with intensive systems producing methane. But there's some interesting papers. People have looked at this issue, as you can well imagine in this day and age, trying to weigh up the pros and cons of keeping cattle or sheep on grasslands in relation to the methane that they're producing. And I think you can say that the benefits of grazing for biodiversity benefits outweigh the methane problem, because the methane problem is very much more related to the intensive systems in our agricultural scenarios.
Okay.
You can probably hammer holes through my argument, because I'm just looking at various papers about the methane story. It is very complex. Forage quality, the age and physiology of the animal can affect methane emissions. The live weight gain or productivity of the animals will affect it, the amount of methane per unit of animal product at the end. And generally speaking, these low intensity semi-natural grasslands produce relatively low methane per the amount of animal product that is produced at the end compared with intensive systems.
Okay, thank you. Anna, question for you. Do wormers find their way into watercourses too via soil water?
Yeah, there's been a few studies that have kind of demonstrated that. So I think it's another sort of reason why sometimes fencing off of watercourses is probably quite a good thing to do. So not just in terms of, you know, manure going in and nutrifying watercourses and then silt and things like that, but actually, yes, you know, if they are actually just like dunging straight into a watercourse, then there's clearly a very clear pathway for that insecticide to get into the watercourse and have impacts. But there's also been other studies showing that actually when you've got residues of some of the products in manure heaps over winter, some of that leachate can get into watercourses. So that again is just another reason why you need to be really careful with where you place manure heaps over the winter, because a lot of livestock get treated at housing. And so then the idea is that hopefully that will have, or just sort of metabolized over the course of the winter. So by the time you maybe are spreading that manure in the summer or in the spring, then that will have, you know, that the problem has gone away, but it hasn't always. So trying to keep manure away from watercourses, which you need to do anyway, of course, but that's just another reason to do that. And then there's the other sort of side of it as well. So there's a lot of products have been banned in agriculture that are still available for sort of treatment of fleas and things for pets in the UK. And there was a study last year about the use, I think it was fipronil, and another product I think is a sort of a neonicotinoid that were finding their way into watercourses with some consequences as well. So, you know, it's not just a case for livestock owners, but it's for pet owners as well to just have a think about, you know, when it's necessary to treat and thinking about, letting animals into watercourses or washing them and letting all that water go into the sewage system straight away. So, yeah, it does get into watercourses. It's a sort of short answer, I suppose.
Thank you. I've got another question for you, Anna. Steve asks, how dispersive dung beetles are and if they require fresh dung throughout the year? I'm
not sure what the sort of definite distances are. I don't know, but certainly whenever I've been looking at dung, they turn up quickly. So they do need to be relatively close, because there are areas in the country where dung beetles seem to have become locally extinct. And so clearly there is a limit to how far they can fly. But yeah, I couldn't say an exact figure. I can do a bit of research. Maybe I should try and find that out. But certainly they can fly reasonable distances, but, you know, they've got a limit. And then in terms of dung resources throughout the winter, each different species of dung beetle has got a slightly different life cycle. So most of them are sort of univoltane, so they only actually have one brood per year. And so that means that they might have just like a focus for maybe sort of late summer or early spring, or some of them do seem to be more active in the winter. So yes, having dung out in the winter is actually really great for dung beetles. So yes, there's certain species, especially some of those geotroop species, you'll find them out in the winter quite a lot, and some of the minotaur beetles as well. So having resources of dung all year round is really beneficial, but it won't be benefiting all the different species at the same time, because they'll all be sort of focusing on different time periods. But yeah, so there are some sort of clashes there in terms of, you know, trying to maintain soil structure and not having too much compaction, and making sure that there are some dung sort of resources out in the landscape all year round. So and then that has knock-on sort of benefits to some of the other species. So obviously I worked with the Horseshoe-back project, and they do still hunt in the winter. So we're always trying to encourage people to have livestock out in the winter where possible and where it makes sense and they're not going to cause any damage to the pasture, because those dung beetles are still out there and the bats will be hunting for them. So it's really great to hear that Desley keeps her livestock out as much as she can, because that will be having a, you know, really beneficial impact.
Great. Thank you, Anna. Got a question for you, Desley. Can you say something about grazing in woodlands? You know, what do the cows eat there, and how do they help with biodiversity?
Yep. So they, well, at different times of the year, they eat a lot of grass, of you know, the grass that's there, which they'll also eat during the winter as well. In the summer and autumn and spring, they'll be eating leaves as well. In the winter, they also eat a lot of ivy. And they eat ferns as well. I'm like, I don't recognize the different ferns, so I can't tell you which they are, but they certainly have plenty to eat in the woods. And I guess they help with biodiversity in the same way as they do in fields as well, you know, just by kind of, you know, moving seeds around and breaking up the soil structure, and just breaking up the shrub growth as well, kind of just opening things up, and just sort of making changes where they are, just by being there, really, you know, doing their dung and letting the grass grows around it, you know, just as it does in grassland as well.
Okay, thank you. One more question then for you, I think, because we're coming up now, maybe last couple of questions. What animal trackers do you use, and what age calves can you put them on?
Oh, I don't know about age of calves. I mean, the trackers are quite heavy, but they're used on goats as well. So presumably a calf could cope with them. That's the digit animal ones. So we use digit animal trackers, and they tell us sort of some information about, you know, the temperature of the animal, how much it moves around, as well as where it is. We also want to get some no fence collars, which are the ones with the sort of the invisible fence as well. We sort of need to train the cattle up to use those, and we need to train to use them as well before we do start using them. But again, I don't know what the age. I mean, I don't think you can put those on calves, but I don't know what the minimum age is for wearing them, I'm afraid.
Okay, thank you. Right, last question, and this is back on dung again. Pheasants dissect our cattle's dung within days because they have a chute next door to them. Will this reduce the dung's effectiveness in the dung beetle cycle?
Oh,
any thoughts?
That's interesting, isn't it? Yeah, with the pheasants, because, you know, they're sort of an unnaturally high population density. So usually, you know, it's a natural process, isn't it? So these dung pads get picked apart and the dung beetles have evolved alongside it. And so you see them decimated by all kinds of different bird species, and it doesn't seem to matter. But yeah, when it's just a massive amount of pheasants, maybe it does. But hopefully some of those species will have managed to have at least, you know, completed a part of their life cycle. So especially the geotroops, if they're sort of going right down into the soil, the things that can really impact them would be things like ploughing and cultivation, because that can then, you know, take them out during the time when they're supposed to be their larvae is developing. and that's quite often close to the surface or just a little bit underneath the surface. So yeah, it's a tricky one. It's also, you know, it's a question that horse owners always ask because they want to try and poo pick, and so you're trying to remove the sort of the worm burden from the field and then putting it to one side. So yeah, I think as long as there's some dung out there and it's not full of, you know, different residues of different products, then it's probably going to be fulfilling that function. But yeah, if there's a huge amount of pheasants, then it is probably having some kind of impact. So yeah, I don't know the answer to that, unfortunately, but yeah, it's an interesting question.
Right, thank you, Anna. I think now that's all we've got time for. Thank you for everybody for putting your really interesting questions in, and thank you for joining us. And thank you all again to Jerry, Anna and Desley, and Steve and Tracy behind the scenes. And I hope that you'll be able to join us next week at the same time. We have part 2 of an introduction to conservation grazing with another 3 expert speakers. Key topics will include carbon value of species-rich grasslands, the essential guide to animal health and welfare, and what else have we got? Yes, that's about it really. You can find more details but on the talk and how to register in the events section on the website. That's probably the best place to find out to register, and the talk's free again. Okay, so thank you for joining us.